Welcome to the deep dive. Looks like you're really interested in how standardized testing is impacting education, especially in New Jersey.
It's a hot topic for sure.
You want to know how these tests, especially the ESPA, are changing what and how teachers teach.
Yeah, and are they really helping all students?
hmm
Especially those facing economic hurdles.
Those are big questions. We've got a fascinating deep dive ahead of us with The Ambiguity of Teaching to the Test by William Firestone as our guide.
This book really takes us inside classrooms, and explores whether these tests lead to genuine, deeper understanding.
Especially when you think about the differences in opportunities different socioeconomic groups have.
Exactly.
The book focuses on a 3-year study in New Jersey. What's interesting is that the national standards were pushing for something called inquiry-oriented learning.
Right, where kids are actively engaged, problem-solving, and truly grasping concepts, not just memorizing facts.
Hands-on, minds-on, that sort of thing.
Precisely.
But what Firestone observed in New Jersey classrooms wasn't always lining up with that vision.
He found this gap between the ideal and the reality. For example, one teacher was using M&Ms for a graphing activity.
Sounds fun. Candy and learning what could be better.
Right. But here's the thing. The teacher controlled the activity so tightly, there was no room for the kids to really explore and figure things out on their own.
So it became more about following directions than actually understanding the concepts behind graphing.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. The researchers saw this kind of disconnect over and over again. Teachers would say they were using inquiry-based approaches, but in practice, they were drilling multiplication facts, focusing on procedures rather than understanding. Even when they were using manipulatives, it was often more about getting the steps right than getting the concept.
It almost sounds like the pressure to get good test scores might be pushing teachers towards those more traditional teaching methods.
That's a huge part of it. The book really digs into how that pressure can lead to teachers narrowing their focus drilling test content rather than going for deeper understanding. They call it decontextualized test prep.
So it's like the test itself becomes the goal instead of using it as one way to measure if kids are actually learning.
You got it. And this decontextualized prep is different from what they call curriculum-embedded test prep, where teachers integrate test-like activities throughout the year, but without losing sight of the bigger picture of helping students understand the subject.
So it's like sneaking in test prep while still focusing on real learning.
You could say that. It takes a lot of skill, though. It's a tough balancing act. And what's interesting is that Firestone found a correlation between more traditional teacher-centered teaching styles and this decontextualized test prep, especially in schools with lower-income students.
That raises some red flags about equity. Are these tests really leveling the playing field, or are they actually making things worse for students who are already facing more obstacles?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Firestone's research suggests that this pressure to raise test scores can actually lead to practices that make the achievement gap even wider.
Especially if those scores aren't a true reflection of what students are learning. So it sounds like it's not as simple as saying standardized tests are good or bad. It's about how those tests are being used.
You've got it. And it's about recognizing that they're just one tool in the toolbox.
They can be useful, but they need to be used thoughtfully.
Right. And in conjunction with other measures.
What I find really striking is that we're seeing these trends even in New Jersey, where at the time of the study, there weren't any major rewards or punishments based on the test scores. You'd think without those high stakes, there'd be less pressure.
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the reality is that even without those direct consequences from the state, there were still all these other pressures bubbling up from within the system.
So where was all this pressure coming from, if not from the state level, who was turning up the heat?
Well, for one thing, there was the pressure of public perception. All those newspaper rankings that compare schools based on their test scores. Districts, and especially those in more affluent areas, knew those scores were a big part of their reputation.
It's like everyone was in a competition, even if it wasn't explicitly stated.
Exactly. And then there's the pressure from administrators, both at the district and school level. Even if there weren't formal consequences for low scores, teachers knew that good scores meant more resources, more funding, and a better chance of keeping their jobs.
It's almost like those scores became a currency.
In a way, they did.
It's kind of unsettling to think that even without those direct high-stakes consequences, there was still this underlying anxiety driving so many decisions.
It really speaks to the power of data in our society. We put so much stock in these numbers, even when they don't tell the whole story.
And in this case, it sounds like those numbers might actually be pushing some teachers towards practices that hinder real learning.
That's the concern. And that's why it's crucial to look beyond the scores and ask, what are students really learning? How are they engaging with the material? Are we creating environments that support deep understanding?
So if pressure is one side of the coin, what's the other side? What can we do to counteract those negative forces and help teachers focus on what truly matters?
That's where support comes in. And this is where Firestone's research gets really interesting. He found that the level of support teachers receive, especially from their principals, had a huge impact on how they dealt with the pressure of testing.
It makes sense. If you feel overwhelmed and unsupported, you're more likely to stick to those familiar methods, even if you know there might be better ways to teach.
Exactly. It's like going into survival mode. And that's what Firestone observed. The teachers who felt supported were more likely to try those innovative inquiry-based approaches, even if they were a little riskier or required more effort.
Because they knew they had a safety net.
Exactly. They felt empowered to step outside of their comfort zones. And that support needs to be multifaceted. It's about providing resources like manipulatives and technology, but it's also about high-quality professional development.
It's about creating a culture where teachers can learn from each other and share their successes and challenges.
Right, it's about building a community of practice.
Yeah.
And what Firestone found was that school districts varied quite a bit in their ability to create this kind of supportive environment.
So some districts were better equipped to help their teachers navigate these challenges than others. What were some of the factors that made a difference?
Well, one of the key factors was the district's human capital. Basically, the expertise and knowledge of the folks making decisions about curriculum and instruction. The districts with leaders who really understood math and science education were more effective at supporting teachers.
Makes sense. It's hard to lead effectively if you don't understand the content yourself.
It's like trying to navigate a city without a map. Another factor was the district's social networks, the connections and relationships they had both within the district and with outside organizations.
So a district with strong partnerships with universities or professional development providers would have a leg up. They could tap into a wider pool of expertise and resources.
Exactly. They could bring in high-quality trainers, access cutting-edge research, and learn from other districts. These networks can be a game changer.
It sounds like those relationships can make a world of difference. But I'm guessing that financial resources probably play a role too, right? Districts with more money have more flexibility to invest in those resources and build those supportive environments.
You'd think so. But it wasn't always the deciding factor. Firestone found that even some well-funded districts were still stuck in that traditional test-driven mindset.
So it's not just about how much money you have, but how you use it.
Exactly. Some districts were spending big bucks on test prep materials and drilling kids on narrow test content instead of investing in broader, more engaging learning experiences.
It's like they were missing the forest for the trees.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
They were so focused on those test scores that they lost sight of the real purpose of education.
It all comes back to having a clear vision for what kind of learners we want to develop. We've talked a lot about the pressures teachers are under, the support they need, and how even in a relatively low-stakes testing environment, these tests can cast a long shadow. But what about the tests themselves? Are we even sure they're measuring what we think they're measuring?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you consider that these scores are often used to make big decisions about students, teachers, even whole schools.
If the foundation is shaky, the whole house is at risk.
Exactly. So what did Firestone find? Were there any red flags about the tests themselves?
Well, remember how the ESPA was designed to align with those more progressive national standards for math and science? The ones emphasizing inquiry and deeper understanding.
Moving away from that drill and kill model of learning.
Right. But when they actually analyzed the ESPA test items, they found that many of them didn't really require those higher order thinking skills.
So even though the test was supposed to be measuring these complex learning goals, it wasn't actually living up to that promise. That's what the research suggests. And that raises serious concerns about the validity of these scores. Are they really a reflection of a student's deep understanding? Or are they just measuring their ability to perform on these very specific, often isolated test items?
That's a huge problem. It means we could be making decisions about students, teachers, schools based on data that's not really measuring what we think it is.
It's like using a ruler to measure temperature.
The wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. And this gets back to the issue of equity.
You're saying if the test itself is biased towards certain types of learners, or if it's not accurately measuring the full range of skills that students need, then it's going to put some groups at a disadvantage.
Exactly. Students from lower income backgrounds, for instance, who haven't had the same opportunities to learn, or students who are strong critical thinkers, but who struggle with standardized test formats.
So it's not just about the economic factors we've been talking about, it's also about the limitations, maybe even biases baked into the tests themselves.
Right? We need to be critical consumers of this data. We can't just take these scores at face value. We have to understand the context and think about the potential for bias.
That's a lot to consider, especially for people who aren't experts in educational assessment.
It is. It's
Well,
complex. That's why it's so important to have these open and transparent discussions.
mm.
We need educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, everyone at the table talking about how to use these tests responsibly and ethically.
So it's not about getting rid of standardized testing altogether. It's about using it in a way that actually supports and enhances student learning.
Exactly. The goal should always be to create a more equitable and effective system for all students.
Well said. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this, but this deep dive is definitely helping me see the different layers of this issue.
And we're just getting started. There's so much more to unpack, including the historical context of these tests and how they fit into the bigger picture of education reform.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and dive even deeper.
It's fascinating how this whole push for accountability in education, like with standardized testing being front and center, actually has its roots in the business world.
You mean like we're talking about applying business principles to schools? How did that even happen?
Yeah, it's a trend that's been building for decades. Firestone traces it all the way back to Florida in 1971, where the state started using standardized tests to hold schools accountable for how students were performing.
So instead of just trusting teachers to, do their jobs, we started applying metrics and performance indicators,
Hmm,
like what you might see in a corporation.
exactly. The thinking goes that if you set those clear standards and you measure those outputs and then you hold people accountable, you can boost efficiency and effectiveness just like you would in a business. And this model usually involves four key pieces: content standards, assessments, performance standards, and consequences.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. So content standards are basically what students should learn at each grade level, right?
Exactly. They're the specific knowledge and skills that students are expected to pick up in each subject.
Got it. And then the assessments, those are the standardized tests we use to measure whether they're actually meeting those standards.
That's right.
Yeah.
Then you've got those performance standards. Those are the ones that set the bar for what we consider proficient or advanced.
Right, they determine like the cutoff scores for different levels.
Exactly. And last but not least, you have those consequences, the actions that are taken based on the scores.
So that's where we get into like rewards for schools that do well and sanctions for those that don't.
Precisely. And those consequences can be a pretty big deal. They can range from changes in funding to even school closures. And it can have a huge impact on teacher evaluations. So it's a pretty high-stakes system.
And Firestone is saying that this whole business influence model, while it might have good intentions, has led to some maybe not so great outcomes.
He does. One of the big concerns he highlights is that it's narrowed the curriculum and shifted the focus towards just memorizing things instead of really understanding them.
When the pressure to get those scores up becomes the main goal, it can really distort things.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can actually end up widening the achievement gap rather than closing it.
That's really troubling. It feels like we've gotten so caught up in the numbers that we've lost sight of the human element.
That's a big part of what Firestone is trying to point out.
Yeah.
He wants us to remember that education is more than just those test scores. It's about cultivating curiosity, creativity, and a love of learning.
So how do we shift things back to those essential qualities? If the pressure is coming from this top-down system, what can schools do to create a more supportive and holistic learning environment?
That's where the role of the principal becomes so crucial. Firestone found that how principals responded to these state testing mandates had a huge impact on what was happening in classrooms.
So even in the same district with the same policies in place, you could have completely different experiences depending on the principal's leadership style.
Absolutely. The book really dives into this and talks about how some principals took a more authoritarian approach. They saw themselves as enforcers, putting pressure on teachers to raise those scores no matter what.
It's that my way or the highway approach.
Exactly. But other principals took a more collaborative and supportive stance. They saw themselves as partners working with teachers to make instruction better and create a more engaging learning environment for students.
I think I know which style Firestone found to be more effective.
You're right. When teachers felt genuinely supported by their principals, they were much more likely to try those innovative teaching approaches, the inquiry-based stuff we talked about.
Makes sense. If you feel trusted and respected, you're going to be more willing to take risks and try new things.
Exactly. And it's not just about making teachers happier.
Yeah.
This supportive leadership style also translated into better outcomes for students. The schools with these principles tended to see bigger improvements in student achievement, even on those standardized tests.
So it's not about going easy on teachers or lowering expectations. It's about creating that culture of trust and collaboration where everyone feels like they can do their best work.
That's the key. And the research actually goes deeper. It talks about specific things these successful principals did.
What do they do differently?
Well, one thing that really stood out was they made it a point to build strong relationships with their teachers. They had those regular check-ins listened to, concerns, offered encouragement, all of that good stuff.
It's about open communication and building that sense of shared purpose.
Exactly. And they also went above and beyond with professional development. They didn't just settle for those generic workshops on test-taking strategies. They found those high-quality programs that help teachers actually understand the content better and develop better teaching techniques.
Investing in their teachers' growth, not just those quick fixes for the test scores.
Exactly. And they fostered that culture of collaboration and peer learning. They made time for teachers to meet together, encouraged them to observe each other, and created a space where it was safe to share ideas and ask for help.
It's like they were building a real community, not just a bunch of individuals working in silos.
That's a great way to put it. And they also recognized that teachers need those resources to do their best work.
We're talking about funding for materials, access to technology, all of that.
Right. But they weren't just throwing money at the problem. They were strategic about it. They made sure teachers had what they needed to actually implement those new teaching approaches they were learning about.
So making sure the resources actually aligned with the school's goals and that teachers had a voice in how to use them.
Exactly. It was a very different kind of environment from that traditional top-down model. And the results were impressive. These schools saw better gains in student achievement, and they had happier teachers who stuck around longer.
It's pretty amazing what a difference a good leader can make. It's like they create this ripple effect that impacts everyone.
It shows how much leadership matters. It's not just about managing things or enforcing rules. It's about inspiring people and helping them grow and creating that environment where everyone feels valued.
Makes you think about how important it is to train and develop principles to create these kinds of supportive environments.
Absolutely. It's a great investment. It pays off for everyone. Students, teachers, the whole community.
So we've talked about how those principles can make a huge difference in shaping the school culture and buffering against those pressures that come with standardized testing. But I'm curious to know more about how districts can support their schools in this work.
Great question. Firestone found that some districts were much better than others at providing the resources and support that schools needed to move beyond just teaching to the test.
So what made these high-capacity districts different? Were there any patterns?
One big thing was how they did professional development. The really successful districts went beyond those test prep workshops. They gave teachers opportunities to really dig into the content and the pedagogy behind those standards.
So it wasn't just about memorizing facts and formulas. It was about getting teachers to really understand what they were teaching.
Exactly. And they were also really focused on creating a curriculum that was coherent and well-aligned. They made sure that what was being taught in classrooms actually matched the big learning goals, not just the narrow stuff on the test.
That makes sense. If the curriculum is all over the place, it's going to be hard for students to make those connections and develop a deeper understanding.
Exactly. And another thing these high-capacity districts did well was leverage their internal expertise.
They weren't just relying on outside consultants or packaged programs.
Right. They found those teacher leaders within their own schools and gave them opportunities to share what they knew with their colleagues.
Using the knowledge they already had within the district.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this created a much more sustainable approach because it wasn't dependent on bringing in people from the outside.
So it was about empowering teachers to take charge of their own professional learning.
You got it. And these districts were also smarter about how they use their resources. They invested in good materials and technology, and they made sure everyone had access to them.
So creating a more equitable learning environment where everyone had the tools they needed to succeed.
That was the goal. It really highlights how creating a system that supports deeper learning takes a multifaceted approach.
It's about having strong leadership in the district and in the schools. It's about supporting teachers with professional development and resources. And it's about building a culture that values collaboration and constantly improving.
You nailed it. It's about shifting from that narrow test prep focus to a bigger vision of what it means to be an educated person.
And remembering that every student deserves that chance to reach their full potential no matter where they come from.
Well said. And that brings us to another important question we need to talk about. Are these test scores truly reflecting what students are learning, or are they being influenced by things that are happening outside of school?
Right. We've talked about how pressure and support can affect how teachers teach. But what about those social and economic factors that can impact a child's learning long before they even start school?
That's a huge piece of this puzzle. There's this persistent achievement gap between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds.
Students from wealthier families tend to do better on these tests than those from lower income families.
That's right. And while there are a lot of factors involved, one of the
Yeah.
questions is whether the tests themselves are actually part of the problem.
Are they biased in a way that puts certain groups of students at a disadvantage?
That's one possibility. And Firestone's research shed some light on this question. His team analyzed test scores from the 6 districts in the study, and they took into account things like poverty levels and other demographics.
So they were trying to isolate those outside factors and see if there were any patterns in the scores that couldn't be explained by them.
Exactly. And what they found was that even after controlling for those variables, there were still big differences in test scores across districts.
So even when you compare students from similar backgrounds, there are still these discrepancies in how they perform.
That's what the data shows. And makes you wonder if those differences are truly reflecting what students have learned, or if they're a result of something else, like the quality of instruction, the resources available, or even just the cultural biases baked into the tests themselves.
It's like we're comparing apples and oranges. We're using the same test, but the students are coming to it with very different experiences.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights how risky it is to use these scores as the only measure of student learning or school effectiveness.
Yeah.
We could end up making things even more unequal if we're not careful.
It's a bit scary to think about. It means we can't just assume that higher test scores automatically mean better schools or better teachers.
Right? We have to look at the whole picture and consider all the other factors that go into student success.
So we need to move beyond those simple rankings and sound bites and really dig into the data, understand the context, and be aware of potential bias.
Exactly. It's about being informed and using this information to make decisions that truly benefit all students.
That's a really powerful message. It makes me wonder if these standardized tests aren't always a reliable way to measure learning. What are some other ways we can assess student progress and how well schools are doing?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of educators and researchers are wrestling with right now. There's a growing movement towards what are called authentic and performance-based assessments. These ask students to show what they know through real-world tasks and projects.
That sounds a lot more engaging than just filling in bubbles on a test.
It is. And it lets students show off their creativity, their problem-solving abilities, and how they can actually apply what they've learned.
It's about showing that you can actually use your knowledge, not just memorize facts.
Exactly. And there's also a push to look at evaluation more holistically, to consider more than just those test scores to things like student engagement, social emotional learning, and the overall school environment.
Recognizing that education is about more than just academics.
Absolutely. It's about developing the whole child and getting them ready for life, not just school.
That's the big goal. And it means shifting our mindset from those narrow tests to a much broader view of what it means to be educated.
This deep dive has really helped me understand how complicated standardized testing is and how important it is to think critically about it.
It's shown us that education is about so much more than just those test scores. It's about nurturing those qualities like curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, and a love of learning.
It's about building a system that supports and empowers every student to reach their full potential.
Well said. And that's a journey that we're all on together.
It has been a fascinating exploration, and I'm glad we could dive into this with everyone.
We've still got a lot to unpack, but we've laid a good foundation for understanding this complex issue.
We have, and I hope everyone listening will continue to explore this and be part of these crucial conversations about the future of education.
Well said. Let's take a quick break and then come back to wrap up and share some key takeaways from our deep dive into the world of standardized testing. All right, we're back, and wow, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It really makes you think about everything that goes into education beyond just those standardized test scores.
We've covered so much, the effects on what happens in classrooms, the roles and principals in districts, the whole system.
And those big questions about fairness. Are these tests really measuring what they should be? Are they fair to all students?
So much to consider. So with all of that in mind, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, the first thing is to remember that tests are just one piece of a much bigger picture. They can give us some information, but they should never be the only thing that drives how we teach or how we judge schools and teachers.
It's about seeing the whole student, not just a number on a test.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that the impact of these tests really depends on a lot of things. How they're used, what resources are available, the kind of leadership in the schools and districts.
So we can't just look at a score and assume we know the whole story.
Right. We have to understand the whole system.
And something we definitely can't ignore is the question of equity. We have to be so careful about bias, both in how these tests are made and how they're used.
We have to make sure we're not using them in a way that hurts some students while helping others.
That's so important. And what I'm taking away from this is that we can't just sit back and say, oh, well, the system is broken. We have to do something about it.
I agree. It's about having those conversations at the local level with teachers, administrators, parents, school board members. It's about getting involved and pushing for change so all students have a fair shot.
So what can our listeners do if they want to learn more or get involved?
Well, there are a ton of great resources out there. The Ambiguity of Teaching to the Test is a good place to start. But there's so many other books, articles, websites that dive into this.
And there are some amazing organizations working to change how we do standardized testing and pushing for better ways to assess students.
Some are focused on improving the tests themselves. Others are working on making the whole system more transparent and accountable. It's about finding those groups that align with what you believe in and supporting them.
I love that idea, finding your people, the ones who share your passion for making education better.
And don't underestimate just talking to people about this. Talk to teachers, parents, school board members. The more we have these conversations, the more we can start to make things better.
This deep dive has really changed how I think about standardized testing.
It's a reminder that education is so much more than just those scores. It's about helping students develop those essential skills, like curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, and a love of learning.
It's about creating a system that helps every single student reach their full potential.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all work towards together.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of standardized testing.
It's been a pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better future for all students.
That's what it's all about. Thanks for listening.